Right. Graham.
Thank you, Convener. In the interests of time, my opening question I think can be answered by a nod of the head or a shake of the head or a simple yes or no. Excuse me. A few moments ago, Willie Rennie advanced a theory, a criteria, if you like, that under twos should attract, or 2-year-olds rather, should attract an enhanced rate because of the ratios that would be required to supervise them. Do we accept that's the case? Yes or no? I'm seeing nodding head. So we accept that's the case. Excuse me, Convener. In which case, Matthew Sweeney, why are so many councils not paying an enhanced rate for 2-year-olds set against what's available for 3 and above?
I think I make the same point that I made to Willie Rennie earlier. I don't have sort of the information on individual processes that they went through to set rates in every single area. And I think what would be absolutely clear is not looking at rates alone. Indeed, the report, I imagine, where I think this has been taken from, also set out the range of in-kind support which is provided to the councils, whether that's quality assurance, training and development, LETs. There's a range of other support that's provided. So it's very difficult to purely look at rates on their own and not understand the full context of what's going on between a local authority and their partners in a certain area.
I don't necessarily accept that at all. I mean, there's a number of councils are doing this. If you take Angus Council, my own local council, has got the 4th highest rate for 2-year-olds in the whole of the country, and is paying considerably more for them than for 3-year-olds and above. So clearly there are some councils who are walking the walk here. Which takes me on to the question about the process for the setting of rates. And forgive me, this is a bit of a layman's question perhaps, but what is the process? What are councils meant to take account of? Is it issues such as the costs of rent in an area, economies of scale, etc.? So what do they take account of in setting the rate? And what is the involvement in the private sector in that process? Do they have discussions? Is there an input? Is there any appeals procedure if the rates that are being offered are deemed to be completely unsatisfactory? Matthew Sweeney again, perhaps to start.
Thank you. So I think it's all of those things, and there was very detailed guidance that was created in 2019 for local authorities, which was developed by the Scotland Excel, commissioned by the Scottish Government, agreed by the Scottish Government and ourselves. And absolutely, it sets out the ways in which local authorities work with their partners. And indeed, across the country, there's a range of forums that exist between local authorities and their partners to discuss the setting of sustainable rates. I think what we would flag is that it's not just around what local authorities do, it's what partners bring to the table. And one of the challenges that we've found so far, and what local authorities reported back, was it was difficult to get consistent, high-quality information from partner providers to make sure that we were setting those states in an informed way, because it's very clear from that guidance that the Scottish Government drafted that these need to be as evidence-based as possible. And indeed, that was one of the challenges that local authorities were facing repeatedly. And that is why, through the process that we've been just going through over the last few months, we've created a national cost collection exercise, repeating a process that had existed in 2016 by the Scottish Government, and pulling together some of the core information on provider costs across the country, and then providing them as outputs to local authorities to inform their rate setting. But we've been absolutely clear throughout that process that that is not a replacement of the ongoing engagement that they'll have with their partners already, and with their understanding of local ELC market conditions. And lastly, what I would flag is there's been a significant increase at rates, moving from, I think it was 378 in 2017 to an average of now 544. And as I mentioned earlier, that's by far the leading rate across the UK, almost £1 more in Wales for the year 2021-22.
Indeed, and that reflects very positively on the Scottish Government. But can I ask Jonathan Broadbury, perhaps, for his view of how this process works in practice?
Yeah, so in practice, it is a very mixed view. As Matthew said, there's a number of different ways that local authorities will go about this, and not all of them, open and consultative with partner providers. And we have supported the national cost collecting exercise because there's been such a mix across Scotland. But what we feel is that actually this has been quite a large exercise, drawing in a lot of time from local authority, well, not from local authority, but from the people on this panel, but also from providers to give that information to this exercise, and it's quite clear that this it was last done in 2016. It's quite clear that this couldn't be done, or would be very, very demanding to do this year on year, when actually, we know what inflation levels are, we know what changes to the real living wage are, and when we asked local authorities last year about their plans to change rates, even though everybody had the real living wage figures, the national living wage figures, and minimum wage figures, 9, I think, out of the 32 were holding at least one of their funding rates at the same level. So we don't understand how that can be put across as a sustainable rate when everybody knows the costs going up for those delivering the funded ELC places, and there needs to be an annual mechanism, either at a national or a local authority level, that's quite clear and transparent for providers, for parents, that says this is how we're going to make sure the funding does follow the child all the way to the setting where they take place, and actually that it will rise in line with the rising costs, because otherwise childminders will leave, nurseries will close, and parents won't have access to local services in the way that they need, or the choice that they might want locally in terms of that flexibility. They might be left with 1 or 2 options, and none of them what they want. So there is a real challenge there about how we make sure that those rates do reflect actual delivery costs, and I think over 3/4 of our members said that they don't currently. Matthew referenced there the rates from 4 or 5 years ago, and yes, it's true that they have been increased, and that's really important, but those were coming from historically low levels, and really at a time, really undercutting what providers were doing. But at that point as well, and I just need to make this point very, very quickly, at that point, providers, if they were in partnership, were delivering in 600 hours. So there were other streams of income from parental fees that could make up for that shortfall. In this scenario where we go up to 1140, that meets the needs for the vast majority of parents. So there's not other income streams coming into partner providers in the same way that there would have been when those rates were basically chronically underfunded.
Just one final question I make. Are there any particularly bad examples that you can offer or furnish us with where the relationship between individual local authorities and your members have been particularly challenging?
We've worked in a number of areas. I don't particularly want to sort of name names at this point, because we've done a lot of work. I'm going to resist the encouragement there. We've done a lot of work with a lot of different areas, networked with COSLA to address some of those issues. But I think the committee have been provided with a list of local authorities who haven't increased their rates, and we've published and named those in releases in the past. And what we're really wanting to see is actually, that's the position where people are now. We've got local authorities setting their rates now, so we really want to urgently encourage all of those local authorities to look at different sources of data, including the national cost exercise, talk to providers about the challenges that they're facing. Well over half of our members say that the real living wage, the biggest barrier to implementing that fully is the sustainable rate that they're being paid. So there's a lot of things that local authorities could be talking to their partners about to really understand what that sustainable rate needs to look like.
Okay.
I do have further policy suggestions at a national level, and I can come on to those later, but I'm conscious of other people wanting.
I appreciate that, Convener, unless anybody else wants to come in.
Yeah, both Matthew and then Jane. So let's have Matthew first, then Jane.
I think Jonathan's contribution is really helpful there. I think one of the things I would flag in the first instance is, of course, that some local authorities took a decision 2 years ago to set a multi-year rate, and therefore that's why it won't have increased. They wanted to give that certainty to providers in advance, and therefore that's why it won't increase year on year. Now, I think there's an interesting debate we can have whether that's worthwhile, whether the certainty versus whether an annual increase should happen, but I think that that's something that I think just to note. The second one I point out is, again, that there is a gap which local authorities are having to meet because of the reduction of funding from the Scottish Government. I mentioned in my answers earlier, before the £25 million was removed from the ring-fence settlement, that was only increased in inflation with, I think, somewhere between 1% and 2%, whereas where inflation was last summer. We're now facing inflation around 9%. And how are local authorities meant to meet those large inflationary increases and perhaps quite large increases to the real living wage when the funding available to them has actually decreased, and it was set at a time before the inflation was at the levels that they were at just now. And then lastly, the point I come on to is I don't think it's just around the sort of local authorities and how they work together with their partners. We saw during the cost collection exercise there was actually sort of some partners who were encouraging others not to take part in our survey, and indeed to sort of perhaps give incorrect information to try and artificially inflate some of the results that they've got. But I think we need to be really clear it's about how colleagues work together to do this in a really sort of open, honest and transparent way. That's what we've done through this survey, and that's what we're trying to support as this process goes forward.
Yeah, there does seem to be a pressing need for genuine partnership working on this, which is a bit lacking at the moment. Sorry, Convener.
Thank you, Graham. Jane, I think, wants to come in on your line of questions as well, so you may wish to come back after you've heard what Jane has to say.
Thank you. I just echo a lot of the comments that Jonathan has raised as well. It's in terms of good practice and good engagement, it can be quite patchy across local authorities. We've heard from members of really good practice and it works well, and they have that genuine partnership between the local authority and the wider ELC sector, and that's really heartening to hear. And then we hear of other very challenging ways of engagement or lack of engagement. And you mentioned there about routes of appeal. There are several of our members actively investigating that at the moment, and it can be very difficult to do that in isolation. So I think it's very hard to separate all of the issues that we're raising today that are affecting the sector and really challenging, because it does stem from the importance of that partnership. If we get that right between the local authority and the wider sector, that can help towards this journey. But I think the main thing is that there's a sense of apathy across the sector, that they're continually asked to provide information in a range of ways, and very keen to do that, but that can be quite burdensome when they've got all the other challenges, post-pandemic staffing, inspection regimes. They're doing all of that as well as opening their books and showing that willing. And then there's that sense of not feeling that the local authority is required to do the same thing. So overall, I would say it's so important that there is that emphasis, as Jonathan said, around will there be this annual review of the rate, an annual uplift, a recognition that the real living wage is not aspirational, and it will never help the sector to narrow the gap between the salaries and the terms and conditions and the attractiveness of leaving this sector and going into the public sector for the staff that they work with. So it's very hard to separate all of that, because the ongoing pressures of inspections and the lack of the fact that we've not got this shared inspection, and that they're continuing within ELC at the moment when it's not happening in the primary and secondary settings, that can be quite difficult for the sector as well. So the sustainability is at the heart of this, and we need to get it right, and we need to talk together, and we need to work in partnership and have a way that the sector doesn't feel they'll give all this information and then there's this perception that nothing will change, because authorities may or may not engage with that information that they have.
So, Jane, is it your view that the local authorities have a conflict of interest in all of this?
Well, it's hard to not say that they don't, because they're having to be the guarantors of quality as well for the sector. So there will naturally be that tension.
Okay, that's very clear. Graham, do you want to come back in?
Just to thank everybody for answers, it does seem that the progress that's been made is all the more remarkable based on some of the things that we've heard this morning.